Welcome to the Epoch Sunday School class for January 17th. This is our third lesson exploring the rise of Christianity based on Rodney Stark's work, as well as some of my own research. I know we can't interact in real time like we would in a live Sunday school class, so if you have any questions, please let me know, or anything that will help your experience, don't hesitate to let me know. Today we're looking at the mission to the Jews. Christianity began in Jerusalem and spread throughout the Roman Empire, but just how many Jews did accept Christ in those early years? Well, one thing that Rodney Stark points out is that just because there were Jews that thrived, synagogues that thrived and continued to exist throughout the centuries, doesn't mean that there weren't a number of Jews that converted to Christianity, particularly in the early days. When the Italians, for example, immigrated to America, there were little Italies that popped up in a lot of American cities. But that, just because those would thrive, doesn't mean that there weren't Italians that were assimilating into American culture, learning English, even marrying people of other ethnicities. So just because one thing can be true and can thrive doesn't mean another thing can't be true at the same time. As with the Jews, many Jews became Christians. Let's step back and look at something in the course of Jewish history. There were a number of times in Jewish history when the Jews were dispersed, times when they, for one reason or another, left their homeland of Israel. And those who were dispersed permanently, making their residence in another land, are commonly referred to as Diaspora Jews. This comes from a Greek word for scattering or dispersing. One example of the Old Testament forecasting this is in Deuteronomy 28. This is right after the Exodus, and there's this warning. If you do not obey the Lord your God, you do not follow the commands, there's this whole list of curses that are going to take place. And about 50 verses later of a whole bunch of unpleasant consequences, we read, "The Lord will scatter you among the nations from one end of the earth to the other. You will worship other gods that your fathers have not even known." And I don't think that you can claim that every time or every movement, every scattering of the Jews outside of their homeland was the result of punishment, consequences for sin. But in the biblical record, there are at least a couple that were clearly consequences of unfaithfulness. So, for example, you remember that Israel split after Solomon into Israel and Judah. And then the northern kingdom was taken over from the north, and they were dispersed. That was the first diaspora. The southern kingdom was taken over from Babylon and exiled to Babylon. And that was another diaspora. And even when the Persians took over Babylon and allowed many of the Jews to return back to Palestine, there were a number that stayed back in Babylon, particularly the wealthy and well-established. And even those that left Babylon, some of them kept going to other places. They didn't all go back to Judea and Palestine. So there was this diaspora forming where Jews were becoming more and more spread out. Now, both of those first diasporas that we just mentioned here, when the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were overtaken, the prophets in the Bible saw that clearly as God's divine judgment on Israel's unfaithfulness. Now, over the next few centuries, there was an ever-changing political landscape. There were lots of different empires, and the Jews spread for various reasons all over the place, sometimes because they were conquered, but sometimes because of economic opportunity, sometimes in really big numbers. Ptolemy took over 120,000 Jews to Egypt, it said. So they were being spread all over the place, and eventually, by the time of Jesus, they think that there were, they named this place Judea around the time of Jesus, just so you know, but they think that there were about 1 million Jews living in the Palestine, Judea area, and about 4 to 6 million outside of Palestine. So the majority of Jews did not live in the Promised Land. So what happened to these millions of Jews, particularly the ones that did not live in Judea and Palestine? they became Hellenized, which means that they were heavily influenced and affected by the Greek culture and language of the era. Many cultures maintained a good bit of their languages. However, the Jews, even before this time, started speaking more in Aramaic. A couple hundred years later, they were speaking some Greek, and they eventually lost their fluency in Hebrew. And the Old Testament was translated into Greek. On the right, you see a Greek translation of the Old Testament. So eventually, many Jews were reading, writing, speaking, thinking, and worshiping in Greek. In the Jewish catacombs, for instance, in Rome, they found that over 98% of the inscriptions were in Greek or Latin, not in Hebrew or Aramaic. And that's the specifically Jewish catacombs. The Jews were taking Greek names, and they were even adopting some lines of pagan thinking. Now, something to consider behind a lot of this is that this era, we were finding the Jewish people marginalized. They were not feeling like they belonged anywhere. They lived in cities, but they might have been finding that some of their customs with their faith really set them apart, and some of it might not have been completely necessary or seemed completely necessary. So some of the core components of their faith gradually were starting to shift. They would maintain a lot of the core components of their faith, but some other things like the ethnic identity, some of the outward signs, the ceremonial things were compromised. And many of the people did still make pilgrimages to Jerusalem, but a lot of them weren't able to. And many of the Jews of the diaspora were only observing the law superficially, if much at all. So the Hellenization process, this might have solved some of their marginalization, but they still found themselves stuck in between. No longer did they fit in with the more devout traditional Judaism of their cousins in Jerusalem. So they're marginalized in that way, but they're also still not quite fitting in with the pagan culture surrounding them. Enter Christianity. So we find a couple of clues in Scripture to suggest that the Hellenized Jews of the diaspora would be interested in Christianity. In John chapter 7, you read this account of Jesus talking about how he's only going to be with the people for a short time, and then he's going where they cannot come. And the Jews say to one another, "Where does this man intend to go where we cannot find him? Will he go where our people live, scattered among the Greeks, and teach the Greeks?" They're talking about the diaspora there. That's the word right there, is diaspora. Scattered is diaspora. In Acts chapter 2, you might remember last week, Pastor Brian talked about this in his sermon, that Jews from all over and around the Roman Empire came to Jerusalem, and they witnessed the Holy Spirit baptism. They witnessed the language phenomenon, and many believed. Also, James writes to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, and Peter writes to the scattered exiles throughout the Roman Empire. So you see that there was definitely an expectation and a reality that Hellenized Jews, Jews from all over the Roman Empire, were a target audience. So many were finding Christianity to be a faith that not only accepted their inspired moral and historical authority of the old Hebrew scriptures, but it was also seen to fulfill them and their messianic expectations, and it's a bit more palatable and familiar to Greek tastes, even if it does reject the common polytheism. Now, it is thought, while certainly not all Hellenistic Jews became Christians, a considerable amount of the initial converts were Jewish. There were diaspora Jews in all the major centers of the empire. Ethiopia, for example, was considered to be half the population was considered to be Jewish, and a lot of them converted to Christianity. It's not too hard to see how Christianity could have spread. The Jerusalem Council, we read about that in Acts chapter 15. That happened in the year 50, and it resulted in a Christian faith that placed less emphasis on the outward signs, the ceremonial laws, the ritual laws, but maintained the moral laws, the laws of the heart. So where did the Jewish Christians that have this good news about this new faith that builds off of their Jewish faith, where do they go first? They go to the diaspora Jews in all the major centers of the empire, who are actually quite used to having traveling teachers from Jerusalem come and visit. That was something that happened normally. Chances are the missionaries had family, friends, other connections in these communities. And Paul himself was a Hellenized Jew. So how many other missionaries were Hellenized Jews? So we see Christianity spreading all over through these empires, and these people are written to throughout the New Testament scriptures. And most of them were familiar with a lot of the elements of the Hebrew Bible that are referred to in the New Testament. Some other things worth mentioning that we're not going to dig deep into, but are related to this, is that we know that the Jews would not be surprised to see a Messiah coming from the line of David, from the tribe of Judah, but also from their promised land. Most of the Gentiles, the non-Jews, would consider this land of Israel relatively unexciting. There's a man named Jack Finnegan, who is a historian and archaeologist, who has demonstrated evidence that the cross was actually a symbol found in Hebrew manuscripts to signify the Messiah before Jesus' days and his crucifixion. So it's possible that to many Jews, they were already familiar with the cross being a messianic sign. The cross would have been repulsive to the Gentiles with its shame attached to it. Now, the reality of the Roman justice system also, and the corruption of the Jewish high priesthood, was no secret. And the unjust crucifixion of Jesus would likely not be a surprise to the diaspora Jews, possibly even something that they would sympathize with. In the New Testament, you'll see a name of a lot of converts that were Hellenized Jews. They are listed in the New Testament. And missionaries, Christian missionaries, often taught in the synagogues, and there's evidence of this well into the second centuries, that they were still welcomed into a lot of synagogues around the empire. And kind of along the same line of thought, archaeology has shown that early Christian churches outside of Palestine were concentrated in the Jewish sections of the cities. So at least throughout the empire in general, perhaps not so much in Judea and Palestine, around Jerusalem, but around the Roman Empire, there wasn't so much hostility that they couldn't share the same neighborhood. So for any of these, you can find some more literature and dig deeper if you would like to. But next week, if you didn't enjoy this lesson as much, next week maybe you'll really like it. It's really interesting, perhaps the most interesting lesson yet. We are going to look at the role of epidemics, and we are going to look at the role of women. There was something special about Christianity that changed the world for women. So these are fascinating things, colorful times to look at. Thanks for listening. Talk to you later.